In the Frost family home, a 28-year-old marketing coordinator was about to have her world shattered. What started as a birthday celebration took a shocking turn when they came face to face with a devastating family secret. Seraphina Larks wasn't your typical family gathering attendee. For 25 years, she had spent her life seeking approval from her coldly distant Uncle Lysander, known for her desperate need to understand his rejection. When they encountered Evangeline's dementia-induced revelation, she had no idea she was walking into a truth that would redefine everything. Seraphina's determination would lead to unraveling carefully constructed lies. What began as an elderly woman's confused slip would become a journey challenging everything about love and sacrifice. The family would never be the same. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if the story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. The afternoon light streaming through Evangeline's lace curtains felt different today, though Seraphina couldn't pinpoint why. Perhaps it was the way Lysander positioned himself against the kitchen doorframe, maintaining his usual careful distance from the family gathering. Or how Evangeline's eyes seemed to drift between clarity and confusion, like someone grasping at dissolving memories. Seraphina smoothed her silk scarf, a nervous habit from college, and surveyed the modest assembly celebrating Evangeline's 65th birthday. The living room's familiar floral furniture held the weight of 3 generations of Frost family celebrations, faded but dignified. Thalia moved between rooms with practiced efficiency, her movements betraying an anxiety that simmered beneath her carefully maintained composure. She carried perfectly triangulated finger sandwiches, crusts removed with the precision of someone who found comfort in controlling small details. "Sarah, dear, help me with the cake," Thalia called, her voice carrying that forced brightness Seraphina recognized as a warning sign. Her mother had been on edge all morning, triple-checking decorations with an urgency that seemed disproportionate to a simple family birthday. But first, Seraphina found herself studying Lysander again, as she had countless times throughout her life, searching for warmth, for any indication that she mattered beyond obligation. He stood with crossed arms, steel gray hair perfectly groomed, despite coming from a construction site. Even in pressed khakis and the button-down shirt Evangeline probably bought him for Christmas, he carried himself with controlled stillness, someone accustomed to measuring twice, cutting once. His pale blue eyes swept the room with security guard efficiency. Those eyes had never met hers with anything approaching paternal warmth. As a child, she'd convinced herself she'd committed some unknowable transgression. As a teenager, she decided he simply disliked children. As an adult, she'd settled on believing Lysander Frost was constitutionally incapable of emotional connection, a theory that explained his distance while absolving her of fault. Uncle Lysander, she approached with careful politeness perfected over decades. "How's the Morrison project?" Asking about work was safe territory, neutral ground allowing pleasantries without venturing into actual relationship building. "Ahead of schedule," he replied with the measured tone he'd use with clients. "Should finish next week if weather holds." "That's wonderful. You've always been so reliable." Something flickered across his features, so briefly she almost missed it, before his expression settled back into familiar, polite disinterest. "Reliability pays the bills," he said, looking past her toward the kitchen. "Your mother needs help." The gentle dismissal was unmistakable. Seraphina felt familiar rejection settle in her chest like a stone dropping into still water. After 28 years, she should be immune to this hurt, but it found her with the same precision every time. In the kitchen, Thalia removed an elaborate chocolate cake from its box with bomb-diffusing intensity. "The frosting got smudged during transport," she murmured, using a small spatula to repair barely visible imperfections. "I should have made it myself, but work's been so busy." "Mom, it's beautiful," Seraphina assured her, placing a gentle hand on Thalia's shoulder. Her mother's tension was palpable, muscles coiled tight beneath her cream sweater. "Evangeline will love it." Thalia looked up, dark eyes searching Seraphina's face with almost desperate intensity. "You think so? I want everything perfect for her. She's been having more difficult days lately." They'd all noticed Evangeline's increasing confusion, conversations slipping away mid-sentence, searching for words that once came naturally. The early-onset dementia diagnosis 6 months ago had arrived with a brutal efficiency, reshaping all future expectations.
When they returned carrying the cake, Evangeline sat in her favorite burgundy velvet armchair, looking smaller than usual, but smiling with warmth that made her their family's emotional center. They sang Happy Birthday with slightly off-key harmony that characterized family celebrations. Lysander's bass voice rumbled beneath the melody, and for a moment, familiar ritual seemed to soften his posture. Seraphina watched him note how his expression gentled, looking at his sister, genuine affection replacing usual careful control. If only he could look at her that way, just once. Evangeline closed her eyes to make her wish, candle flames dancing across weathered features. When she opened them, confusion flickered, her gaze darting around as if awakening somewhere unfamiliar. "Evangeline?" Thalia's voice carried careful concern. "Are you all right?" "Yes, of course," Evangeline waved dismissively, but movements seemed uncertain. "Sometimes I forget where I am. The mind plays tricks." She blew out candles with unnecessary force, as if dispelling more than flames. The room fell into particular quiet following small ceremonies, everyone searching for words to bridge celebration and the shadow of loss hovering at their gathering's edges. "Well," Evangeline said brightly, "I suppose I'm officially old enough to say whatever I please without apology?" They laughed, grateful for her mood-lightening attempt. Seraphina began cutting cake, focusing on even slices to avoid the weight of Lysander's presence. She could feel him watching, not with warmth, but with peculiar intensity she'd never decoded. "You know," Evangeline continued, accepting a plate, "looking at you all together, it's remarkable how much Seraphina resembles Lysander. Same eyes, same stubborn chin." She paused, expression growing distant. "Of course that makes perfect sense, doesn't it? Since he's her real father." The words fell like stones into a glass house. The silence that followed was absolute, weighted and textured. Seraphina felt the plate slip from nerveless fingers, delicate china shattering against hardwood floorboards with unnaturally loud sound. Chocolate cake scattered across familiar floorboards, frosting roses disintegrating into abstract color smears. Thalia's face went white, hands pressed against her mouth, as if recalling escaped words. Lysander stood frozen in the doorway, carefully controlled expression cracking to reveal something raw beneath. "What did you say?" Seraphina's voice emerged, barely above a whisper. Evangeline blinked, looking around with growing confusion. What did I say? Did I say something wrong? Sometimes words come out wrong now." But Seraphina was staring at Lysander, seeing him as if for the first time. The way he'd always held himself apart, the careful distance, the intensity in eyes she'd never interpreted. Her real father. The words echoed with revelation's force, recontextualizing 28 years of confusion and hurt. Every awkward birthday greeting, stilted conversation, moment of inexplicable disapproval, all suddenly took new significance. "Is it true?" she asked, voice breaking. She looked from Lysander to Thalia, searching faces for denial, for explanation that would make sense of this impossible revelation. Thalia opened her mouth, closed it again, tears streaming. Lysander remained motionless, face carved from stone, but his eyes, those pale blue eyes so much like her own, told her everything. The foundation of her world cracked like spring ice, and Seraphina felt herself falling through the gap into recognizable reality. Everything she'd believed about herself, her family, her place in the world, lay scattered like broken china and ruined cake. She grabbed her purse and fled toward the door. Her aunt's confused apologies and mother's anguished calls followed her into afternoon sunlight. Behind her, the Frost family home, where she'd always felt like an outsider, held secrets that would reshape everything she thought she knew about love, loyalty, and the complex ways families protect their own. The last thing she heard before slamming her car door was Lysander calling her name with emotion she'd never heard from him before. It might have been regret.
It might have been love. But after 28 years of silence, she wasn't ready to stop running long enough to discover which. Seraphina's hands trembled against the steering wheel as she sat in her apartment complex parking lot, the engine ticking as it cooled. She'd driven the 15-minute route from the Frost family home on autopilot, muscle memory navigating, while her mind reeled from Evangeline's words, "Since he's her real father." The phrase played on an endless loop, each repetition making it feel simultaneously more impossible and more inevitable. Her reflection in the rearview mirror showed eyes that were undeniably similar to Lysander's. The same pale blue, the same slight upturn at the outer corners. How had she never noticed? Or perhaps she had noticed, but dismissed it as coincidental family resemblance, the way cousins sometimes shared features across bloodlines. The walk to her third-floor apartment felt surreal, as if she were moving through water. Her keys fumbled against the lock before finally catching, and she stumbled inside to the familiar sanctuary of her carefully curated space. The living room's sage-green walls and cream furniture had always felt like a peaceful retreat from the world's chaos, but tonight, even her own home felt foreign. She collapsed on her sofa, still wearing her coat, and stared at the family photographs arranged on her coffee table, a carefully selected collection spanning decades of birthdays, holidays, and milestone moments. The images seemed to pulse with new meaning, each frame a potential piece of evidence in a puzzle she'd never known existed. Her phone buzzed with a text from Thalia. "Sweetheart, please call me. We need to talk." Seraphina deleted it without responding. Another buzz, this time from an unknown number that she realized must be Lysander. "Can we please discuss this? You deserve answers." She turned the phone face down and pulled a throw pillow against her chest like armor. The silence in her apartment felt oppressive, broken only by the distant hum of traffic and her own ragged breathing. She needed to talk to someone outside the web of family secrets and carefully maintained lies. Her fingers found Jasper's contact without conscious thought. "Hey, Sarah." His familiar voice brought tears she'd been holding back. "How was the birthday party? Did Lysander actually crack a smile for once?" "Jasper," she whispered, her voice breaking on his name. "Whoa, what's wrong? You sound like someone died." I think my entire life has been a lie." The concern in his voice sharpened immediately. "I'm coming over. Don't move. Don't do anything drastic. Just stay put. 20 minutes. While she waited, Seraphina found herself studying the photographs with forensic intensity. There was her 5th birthday party. She remembered the princess costume, the cake shaped like a castle. In the background, Lysander stood apart from the group, his expression unreadable. She'd always assumed he was uncomfortable around children, but now she wondered if he'd been fighting the urge to step closer. Her high school graduation photo showed the whole family arranged on the church steps. Aurelius stood beside her with obvious pride, his arm around her shoulders, while Thalia beamed from his other side. But Lysander stood at the edge of the frame, his hands clasped behind his back, watching her with something that might have been longing. How many moments had she misinterpreted? How many times had she mistaken restraint for rejection? When Jasper arrived with takeout bags and a bottle of wine, he took one look at her tear-stained face and set everything aside to pull her into a fierce hug. "Okay, start from the beginning. What happened?" Through halting words punctuated by fresh tears, Seraphina recounted Evangeline's revelation and the family's stunned reaction. Jasper listened without interrupting, his expression growing more serious with each detail.
Jesus, Sarah, that's massive. How are you processing this? I don't know how to process it, she admitted, gesturing helplessly at the photographs scattered around them. I keep looking at these pictures and seeing things differently. Like this one. She picked up a Christmas morning photo from when she was 12. I always thought Lysander looked angry or uncomfortable, but what if he was actually sad? What if he wanted to be closer but couldn't? Jasper studied the image, noting how Lysander stood behind the couch while everyone else sat together. You know, my dad used to do something similar after he and Mom divorced. He'd come to my birthday parties but keep himself on the periphery, like he didn't know what his role was supposed to be anymore. But this is different.
If what Evangeline said is true, Lysander chose to stay away. He chose to let me think Aurelius was my father. Maybe, Jasper said carefully, or maybe the situation was more complicated than a 5-year-old could understand. These things usually are. Seraphina pulled her knees to her chest, making herself smaller in the corner of the couch. I called him Uncle Lysander for 28 years, Jasper. I actually thanked him for being so reliable today, like he was just some distant family member doing his duty. And the whole time, he might have been struggling with being your father, but not being allowed to act like it. Jasper finished gently. That's gotta be its own kind of hell. The thought made her chest tight with unexpected sympathy. She'd spent so many years feeling rejected by Lysander, but what if he'd been feeling just as rejected? What if every careful distance he maintained, every conversation he cut short, had been an act of sacrifice rather than indifference? Her phone buzzed again, another text from Thalia, more urgent this time. Please, Seraphina, I know you're confused and angry, but there are things you need to understand. Let me explain. You're going to have to talk to them eventually, Jasper observed, noting her staring at the screen. I know. She set the phone aside again. I'm just not ready to hear explanations that might make everything more complicated. Right now, I'm angry, and anger feels safer than whatever this other feeling is. What other feeling? Seraphina was quiet for a long moment, searching for words to describe the strange cocktail of emotions churning in her chest. Hope, maybe? Which is ridiculous because nothing's really changed. Lysander's still the same distant man he's always been. But now there might be a reason for it, and that makes me hope that maybe, she trailed off, unable to finish the thought, maybe there's a relationship worth salvaging.
Exactly, and that terrifies me more than being angry does. As the evening wore on, they ordered pizza and combed through more photographs, with Jasper offering the perspective of someone who'd navigated his own complicated family dynamics. Gradually, Seraphina began to see patterns she'd missed, the way Lysander's attention always seemed to track her movements, even when he appeared disinterested, how he never missed a family gathering despite his obvious discomfort, the thoughtful but impersonal gifts that arrived precisely on time for every birthday and Christmas. By the time Jasper left, Seraphina had made a decision that felt both inevitable and terrifying. Tomorrow, she would confront her mother and demand the truth. Not the careful, protective version Thalia had spent 28 years maintaining, but the real, messy, complicated truth that had the power to either destroy her understanding of her family or finally make sense of it. Either way, she couldn't continue living in the space between knowing and not knowing. The foundation of her identity had already cracked. Now she needed to discover what, if anything, lay beneath the rubble. The next morning arrived gray and drizzling, the kind of weather that seemed to mirror Seraphina's internal landscape. She'd barely slept, spending the night alternating between staring at the ceiling and scrolling through old photos on her phone, searching for clues she'd somehow missed for 28 years. By dawn, her resolve had crystallized into something sharp and unforgiving. She needed answers, and she needed them from the one person who'd had 3 decades to practice her explanations. Thalia's house, the house where Seraphina had grown up, sat on a tree-lined street that had once felt like the safest place in the world. Now, pulling into the familiar driveway, it felt like approaching a crime scene where the evidence of her entire childhood lay waiting to be re-examined. She found her mother in the kitchen, as she'd expected. Thalia had always retreated to this room during times of stress, finding comfort in the ritual of preparing food even when no one was hungry. This morning, she stood at the counter methodically chopping vegetables for what appeared to be enough soup to feed a small army, her movements precise but mechanical. "I wondered when you'd come," Thalia said without turning around, her voice carefully neutral. "I made coffee. Your favorite blend." Seraphina remained in the doorway, unwilling to accept the offered comfort. The kitchen looked exactly as it always had. Warm yellow walls, herbs growing on the windowsill, the scarred wooden table where she'd done homework and eaten countless meals. But now it felt like a stage set, a carefully constructed illusion of domesticity built over a foundation of lies. "We need to talk," Seraphina said, her voice steadier than she felt. "I know." Thalia finally turned, and Seraphina was startled by her mother's appearance.
The woman who prided herself on always being perfectly put together looked exhausted. Her usually immaculate hair pulled back in a messy ponytail, her eyes red-rimmed and puffy. I've been rehearsing this conversation for 28 years. I never imagined it would start with Evangeline's confusion. Is it true? The question came out sharper than Seraphina intended. What she said about Lysander, is it true? Thalia's hand stilled on the dish towel she'd been worrying between her fingers. For a moment, she looked much older than her 53 years, as if the weight of her secrets had been adding years she could no longer hide. Yes, she whispered. Lysander is your biological father. The confirmation hit Seraphina like a physical blow, even though she'd spent the night preparing for it. Hearing the words spoken aloud made them real in a way that speculation couldn't. She gripped the doorframe to steady herself. How? The word came out strangled. When? Why didn't you tell me? Preparing and narrating his story took us a lot of time. So, if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. Thalia moved to the kitchen table and sank into one of the chairs, suddenly looking fragile. Sit down, sweetheart, please. It's complicated. Don't call me sweetheart, Seraphina snapped, but she moved to the opposite side of the table, kneading the barrier between them.
You've lost the right to endearments. Just tell me the truth. Thalia flinched as if she'd been slapped, but nodded. It was 29 years ago. Aurelius was deployed overseas, his second tour in Afghanistan. I was 24, terrified, and desperately lonely. He'd been gone for 8 months, with 4 more to go. Her voice grew quieter. Lysander came by to check on me, to fix a leaky faucet. He'd been doing that, taking care of me while his brother was away. Seraphina felt sick. You had an affair. No, Thalia said quickly, then reconsidered. Not exactly. It was one night, one terrible, wonderful, confusing night when we were both missing Aurelius and scared, and she trailed off, her hands clasped so tightly her knuckles were white. I've gotten word that Aurelius's unit had been attacked. For 6 hours, I didn't know if he was alive or dead. Lysander came over when he got the news, and we comforted each other. It only happened once. Once was enough, apparently. The words came out cruel, but Seraphina didn't care. 28 years of lies had earned her the right to cruelty. Thalia's eyes filled with tears. I found out I was pregnant 2 weeks before Aurelius came home. I was going to tell him everything, I swear I was, but when I saw him at the airport, she shook her head. He looked so broken, Sarah. The war had changed him. He needed something good, something pure to hold on to. And when I told him about the pregnancy, the way his face lit up, so you lied to him too. I tried to tell him, but he was so happy, so proud to be a father. And then Lysander came to see me, and we agreed that it would be better for everyone if Aurelius never knew. Seraphina stared at her mother, trying to reconcile this woman with the person who'd raised her with such emphasis on honesty and integrity. You built my entire life on a lie. You let me think Aurelius was my father, let me grieve him as my father, when the whole time, Aurelius was your father in every way that mattered. Thalia interrupted fiercely. He chose you, Sarah. When you were born and he saw your eyes, Lysander's eyes, he knew. But he held you and chose to be your father anyway. The revelation stunned Seraphina into silence. He knew? He suspected from the moment you were born, but he never said anything. He just loved you, completely unconditionally. You were his daughter because he decided you were. Seraphina felt tears threatening and angrily wiped them away. And Lysander, did he choose me too? Or was staying away part of your little agreement? Thalia's face crumpled. Lysander made a promise to Aurelius. On Aurelius's deathbed, he made Lysander swear that he would never tell you the truth, never disrupt the family we'd built.
Aurelius was terrified that knowing would hurt you, would make you feel unwanted or illegitimate. He made Lysander promise to let sleeping dogs lie. So Lysander's been suffering in silence all these years, playing the distant uncle while watching his daughter grow up? It's been killing him, Thalia whispered. Every birthday, every graduation, every milestone, he's wanted to be closer, but the promise. Seraphina pushed back from the table, pacing to the window where she'd watched countless morning sunrises as a child. The view looked the same, but everything else had fundamentally changed. You stole 28 years from us. 28 years of him being my father and me being his daughter. We were trying to protect you. Don't. Seraphina spun around, fury blazing in her eyes. Don't you dare tell me this was about protection. This was about you being too cowardly to deal with the consequences of your choices. You let me spend my entire childhood feeling rejected by him, wondering what I'd done wrong to earn his coldness. Thalia stood, reaching toward her daughter. Sarah, please. No. Seraphina grabbed her purse and headed for the door. I can't do this right now. I need to think. Where are you going? Seraphina paused in the doorway, her back to her mother. To talk to my father, my real father, the one who's been honoring a promise to a dead man while I've been hating him for reasons I never understood. As she drove away, leaving Thalia standing alone in the kitchen surrounded by the ghosts of 28 years of carefully maintained deceptions, Seraphina realized that her anger at her mother paled in comparison to her growing need to understand Lysander's sacrifice. The man she'd spent her life believing didn't care about her had been bound by promises and honor to a love he couldn't express. Now she needed to know if those bonds could finally be broken. Instead of driving directly to Lysander's construction site, Seraphina found herself pulling over 3 blocks from her childhood home, her hands trembling against the steering wheel.
The weight of her mother's revelations pressed against her chest like a physical thing, making it difficult to breathe. She needed time to process, to understand, before she faced the man who had been her father all along, while she'd believed he barely tolerated her existence. The neighborhood looked smaller than her memories suggested, the way childhood places always did. Modest houses lined streets she'd once thought infinite, their autumn decorations and carefully tended gardens speaking to the kind of quiet stability she'd always taken for granted. She locked her car and began walking, letting muscle memory guide her feet along routes she'd traveled countless times as a child. The park where she'd learned to ride her bike came into view first, its playground equipment updated since her childhood, but the large oak tree in the center unchanged. She could almost hear the echo of her 8-year-old laughter as Aurelius had run alongside her, his hand steady on her bicycle seat until that magical moment when she realized she was riding alone. But now, overlaid on that memory, she recalled another figure watching from a distance, Lysander, standing by his truck at the park's edge, his arms crossed as he observed her triumph. At the time, she wondered why he'd come at all if he was just going to stand apart. Now she understood. He'd wanted to witness her milestone, but couldn't risk getting too close. Couldn't risk the intimacy that would come with being the one to catch her if she fell. Her feet carried her toward Elm Street, where the Hendersons had lived when she was in high school. Their house had the perfect front yard for graduation photos, and she remembered how proud Aurelius had been that day, how he'd insisted on dozens of pictures with her in her cap and gown. The memory crystallized with new clarity as she stood on the sidewalk where it had all unfolded. "One more, princess," Aurelius had said, his arm around her shoulders as Thalia snapped photo after photo. "We need to document this momentous occasion properly." Seraphina had been glowing with the accomplishment of finishing high school with honors, college acceptance letters in hand, the future stretching before her like an unopened gift. But even in her joy, she'd noticed Lysander's position at the edge of the group, his refusal to step into the family photos despite Thalia's gentle insistence. "Lysander, come here," Thalia had called. "You should be in these pictures too." "I'm fine where I am," he'd replied, his voice carefully neutral.
But his eyes, those pale blue eyes that mirrored her own, had been fixed on Seraphina with an intensity that had made her uncomfortable. She'd interpreted his distance as disapproval, assumed he thought she was showing off or being self-centered. The hurt had been sharp enough that she'd stopped smiling as brightly, some of the day's joy dimming under what she perceived as his judgment. Standing there now, 28 years old, and finally understanding, Seraphina felt her heart break for both versions of herself. The 18-year-old who'd felt rejected, and the grown woman who now realized Lysander had been standing apart to avoid stepping into Aurelius's moment, honoring the boundary he'd drawn around his own paternal feelings. The route home took her past the elementary school where she'd walked every morning for 6 years. The crosswalk brought back another memory, this one more painful in its new context. Her 16th birthday party had been at the house. Nothing elaborate, just family and a few close friends. She'd been hoping for a car, like some of her classmates had received, but Aurelius had explained gently that it wasn't in the budget. Lysander had arrived precisely on time, as he always did, carrying a small, wrapped box that looked expensive enough to make Thalia shoot him a warning look. When Seraphina opened it, she'd found a delicate silver compass necklace, the kind of gift that was clearly thoughtful and meaningful, but also somehow impersonal. "It's beautiful," she'd said, meaning it, but confused by the choice. "Thank you, Uncle Lysander." Something had flickered across his face, pain, maybe, or regret. "I thought, you're becoming a young woman now. It's important to always know which direction you're heading." The words had seemed oddly formal, coming from a family member. But before she could ask what he meant, he'd already been reaching for his jacket. "I should let you get back to your friends." "You don't have to leave," she'd protested, though part of her had been relieved. His presence always made her feel vaguely guilty, though she'd never understood why. "I do," he'd said quietly, and there had been something final in his tone that discouraged argument. Now, fingering the compass necklace she still wore, had worn for 12 years without fully understanding its significance, Seraphina realized it hadn't been an impersonal gift at all. It had been a father's blessing, disguised as an uncle's obligation, a wish for her to find her way in the world, given by someone who couldn't openly claim the right to guide her journey. The memory that hurt most came as she turned onto her old street. Christmas morning, she'd been 7 or 8, surrounded by torn wrapping paper and new toys, while the adults lingered over coffee and watched her play. Lysander had been there, as he always was for family holidays, but he seemed more restless than usual, checking his watch frequently and declining Thalia's offers for food or drink. "Stay a little longer," Aurelius had encouraged. "It's Christmas. The worksite isn't going anywhere." "I should go," Lysander had replied, already gathering his coat. But his eyes were on Seraphina, who was trying to assemble a complicated dollhouse that required more patience than her 7-year-old hands possessed.
She'd looked up at him hopefully. "Uncle Lysander, will you help me? Daddy's not very good with small pieces." The expression that had crossed his face had been indecipherable to her child's understanding, a complex mixture of longing and pain that had frightened her a little. "Your dad can handle it," he said, his voice rougher than usual. "He's better at that sort of thing than I am." He'd left within minutes, and Seraphina had spent the rest of the morning feeling like she'd somehow driven him away by asking for help. Standing in front of her childhood home now, Seraphina understood that Lysander hadn't left because he didn't want to help her. He'd left because wanting to help her, wanting to be the one she turned to when she needed something, had been too painful to endure. Every request for assistance, every moment of seeking approval or comfort had been a reminder of the relationship he'd chosen to sacrifice. The weight of understanding settled in her chest, heavy and bittersweet. For 28 years, she'd carried the hurt of believing herself unloved by someone who should have mattered. But the truth was somehow more tragic. She had been loved, deeply and desperately, by a man who'd been forced to express that love through distance and restraint. As she walked back to her car, Seraphina felt something shifting inside her. the anger that had sustained her through the previous day's revelations giving way to something more complex. She thought of Lysander at his construction site, probably unaware that the family secret was finally unraveling, still honoring a promise made to a dying man who'd never imagined the cost his brother would pay for keeping it. The time for walking through memories was over. It was time to face the man who'd been her father all along, even when, especially when, he couldn't admit it to either of them. The drive to Lysander's construction site took 15 minutes through the industrial district on the outskirts of town, but Seraphina felt every second stretching like an eternity. Her hands gripped the steering wheel with white-knuckled intensity as she rehearsed conversations in her head, each imagined scenario more confrontational than the last. 28 years of careful distance couldn't be bridged with a simple conversation, but she had to start somewhere. She found him exactly where she'd expected, at the Morrison renovation project, a Victorian house being converted into luxury condominiums. His truck sat in the gravel driveway alongside two others, and she could hear the rhythmic sound of hammering from somewhere inside the partially gutted structure. The October air carried the scent of sawdust and fresh paint, industrial smells that she'd always associated with Lysander's rare visits to family gatherings. Taking a deep breath that did nothing to steady her nerves, Seraphina approached the front entrance. The door had been removed, leaving only a plastic sheet that fluttered in the afternoon breeze. She called out rather than entering uninvited. "Lysander? It's Seraphina. I need to talk to you." The hammering stopped abruptly. She heard footsteps across creaking floorboards, then Lysander appeared in the doorway, tool belt around his waist and safety glasses pushed up onto his forehead. Sawdust clung to his gray hair, and there was a small cut on his knuckle that he seemed oblivious to. For a moment, they simply stared at each other across the threshold, a father and daughter who had spent decades pretending to be something else. "I figured you'd come eventually," he said, his voice carefully measured in that way she now recognized as emotional self-protection rather than indifference. "Though I thought it might take longer. I talked to Mom this morning." The words came out flat, accusatory. "She told me everything." Lysander's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. "Did she now?" "About you and her when Aurelius was deployed, about the pregnancy, about the promise you made." Seraphina stepped closer, anger giving her courage. "About how you've been my father this whole time, while I thought you could barely stand to be in the same room with me." He was quiet for a long moment, studying her face with those pale blue eyes that she now knew she had inherited. When he spoke, his voice was rougher than usual. "You want to do this here, in front of my crew?" She glanced past him and noticed two other men working in what had once been the living room, both making a studious effort to appear busy while obviously listening to every word. "Fine. Where?"
My office trailer. He gestured toward a small construction trailer parked at the side of the property. "Give me a minute to let the guys know I'm taking a break." The trailer was cramped but clean, furnished with a small desk covered in blueprints and permits, two folding chairs, and a coffee maker that had seen better days. Lysander closed the door behind them, and immediately the space felt too small, too intimate for a conversation 28 years in the making. "Sit," he offered, but Seraphina remained standing, too agitated to settle. "Is it true?" she asked, even though she already knew the answer. "Are you my biological father?" "Yes." The single word fell between them like a stone. No hedging, no softening, just the truth, delivered with the same straightforward honesty he brought to his construction estimates. "And you've known all along?" "I suspected from the moment you were born. You had my eyes, my stubborn chin." His mouth quirked in what might have been the ghost of a smile. "Your mother tried to convince me it was coincidence, but we both knew better." Seraphina felt tears threatening and angrily blinked them away. "Then why? Why did you stay away? Why did you let me think you didn't care about me?" Lysander was quiet for so long, she wondered if he planned to answer at all. When he finally spoke,
His voice carried a weariness that seemed to come from his bones. Because Aurelius was a good man who deserved to be your father without complications. Because your mother needed stability, not scandal. Because he trailed off, running a hand through his hair and leaving more sawdust in its wake. Because what? Because I made a promise to my dying brother that I'd never interfere with the family he'd built, even if that family included my own child. The pain in his voice was so raw that Seraphina felt her anger falter. He asked you to stay away from me? He asked me to let sleeping dogs lie, to never tell you the truth, never claim you as mine, never do anything that might make you question who your real father was. Lysander's hands clenched into fists at his sides. He was terrified that knowing would hurt you, make you feel unwanted or illegitimate. He made me swear on his deathbed that you'd never know. So you sacrificed having a relationship with your own daughter to honor a promise to a dead man? I sacrificed my relationship with you to honor my brother's last wish and protect you from a truth he believed would cause you pain. Seraphina stared at him, seeing clearly for the first time the cost of his choice. But it did cause me pain. All those years of feeling like you disapproved of me, like I wasn't good enough for your attention, that was its own kind of hell. Something cracked in Lysander's carefully controlled expression. You think it was easy for me? Watching you grow up, seeing you succeed and struggle and become this remarkable woman and never being able to? He cut himself off, jaw working as he fought for control.
Never being able to what? Never being able to tell you I was proud of you. Never being able to hug you when you were hurting or celebrate your victories the way a father should. His voice dropped to barely above a whisper. Never being able to tell you that I loved you more than anything in this world, even though I had no right to that love. The words hung in the air between them, 28 years of suppressed emotion finally given voice. Seraphina felt something break open in her chest. Not the sharp crack of anger, but the slow crumble of walls she'd built to protect herself from his perceived rejection. You had every right, she said softly. You were my father. You are my father. No, Lysander shook his head firmly. Aurelius was your father in every way that mattered. I was just the man who provided half your DMA and then stayed out of the way while better people raised you. Stop it! The sharpness in her voice surprised them both. Stop diminishing yourself. Stop acting like biology doesn't matter. Like 28 years of loving me from a distance somehow makes you less my father than the man who chose to raise me. Seraphina, I've spent my entire life wondering what was wrong with me, why you couldn't stand to be around me. Do you have any idea what that does to a child? What it did to me? The anguish that crossed his features was almost too painful to witness. I never wanted you to feel that way. I hoped you'd be so loved by Aurelius and your mother that my distance wouldn't matter. Well, you were wrong. She wiped away tears she hadn't realized were falling. It mattered. You mattered. Even when I thought you barely tolerated me, some part of me kept hoping for your approval, your attention, your love. And now I find out you were holding it back deliberately? Lysander looked as if she'd struck him. I was trying to protect you. From what? From having a father who loved her? From knowing that she was wanted by more people than she realized? Seraphina stepped closer, forcing him to meet her eyes. Aurelius is gone, Lysander. He's been gone for 8 years. Who exactly are you protecting now by maintaining this distance? The question hung in the air like a challenge, and for the first time since she'd known him, Lysander looked uncertain. The man who built houses and fixed problems and approached every challenge with methodical precision seemed to have no blueprint for navigating the wreckage of their relationship. I don't know how to be anything other than what I've always been to you, he admitted finally. Then maybe, Seraphina said, her voice shaking with emotion, it's time to learn.
The conversation with Lysander left Seraphina feeling hollowed out, as if someone had scraped away everything she thought she understood about love and sacrifice and left her with raw nerves exposed to air. She sat in her car outside the construction site for 10 minutes, watching through the windshield as Lysander returned to work with movements that seemed more mechanical than usual, his shoulders carrying a burden that looked heavier than before.
She needed perspective, someone who could help her understand the moral complexity of the choices her family had made, someone who had known all the players in this decades-long drama and might be able to explain how love could be expressed through such careful distance. St. Mary's Catholic Church sat on Maple Street like a brick anchor in a neighborhood of modest homes, its spire visible from anywhere in town. Seraphina had been baptized here, taken her first communion at that altar, and sat through countless Sunday services during her childhood. If anyone could help her parse the spiritual dimensions of her family's secret, it would be Father Gabriel Thornfield, who had known the Blackwood and Frost families for over 3 decades. The heavy oak doors opened with the familiar creak she remembered from childhood, releasing the scent of beeswax candles and old wood that immediately transported her back to quieter times. The sanctuary was empty in the late afternoon light filtering through stained glass windows to paint rainbow patterns across worn pews. Her footsteps echoed softly as she made her way toward the front, where a figure knelt in prayer before the altar. Father Gabriel looked up at her approach, his weathered face creasing into a gentle smile that had comforted her through scraped knees and teenage heartbreaks. At 72, he moved more slowly than she remembered, but his dark eyes still held the same compassionate intelligence that had made him the confidant of choice for 3 generations of parishioners. "Seraphina," he said, rising with careful dignity, "this is an unexpected pleasure, though I suspect from your expression that pleasure isn't quite the right word." "Father Gabriel!" She felt some of the tension leave her shoulders just from being in his presence. "I hope I'm not interrupting your prayers." "Prayer is meant to be interrupted by those who need guidance," he replied, settling into the front pew and patting the space beside him. "What brings you here today, child?" The endearment should have felt patronizing from anyone else, but from Father Gabriel it carried the weight of genuine affection. She sat beside him, suddenly feeling much younger than 28, like the confused teenager who used to seek his counsel about college choices and career paths. "I found out yesterday that my entire life has been built on a lie," she said without preamble. Or maybe not a lie exactly, but a very carefully maintained fiction. Father Gabriel's expression didn't change, but something in his eyes suggested he knew exactly what she was talking about. Would this have to do with your parentage, perhaps? The question hit her like a physical blow. "You knew?" "I suspected," he admitted gently. "When you were born and I saw those unmistakable frost eyes looking back at me during your baptism, I wondered. And over the years, watching Lysander's careful distance and your mother's occasional anxiety during family gatherings, well, an old priest learns to read between the lines." Seraphina stared at him, feeling once again like everyone had been part of a conspiracy she'd been too naive to detect. Did everyone know except me? "I think very few people knew for certain," Father Gabriel said carefully, "but some of us suspected, yes. The question is, how did you find out?" Through halting words, Seraphina recounted Evangeline's revelation and the conversations that had followed. Father Gabriel listened without interruption, occasionally nodding or making soft sounds of understanding. When she finished, he was quiet for a long moment, his gaze fixed on the crucifix above the altar. "Your father, Aurelius, came to see me shortly after you were born," he said finally. "He was struggling with what he'd learned, what he suspected about your parentage. He asked me whether it was possible to love a child completely when you knew she wasn't biologically yours." Seraphina felt tears prick her eyes. "What did you tell him?" "I told him that love is a choice, not a biological imperative.
that the decision to parent a child, to claim her as your own, is often more profound than the accident of shared DNA. Father Gabriel's voice carried the weight of decades of pastoral experience. Aurelius made that choice consciously, deliberately. He chose to be your father in every way that mattered. But he made Lysander promise to stay away. How was that love? Father Gabriel was quiet for a moment, choosing his words carefully. Aurelius was a man who had seen war, who understood sacrifice and duty in ways that perhaps we cannot fully comprehend. He believed, rightly or wrongly, that a family could only have one father, and that confusion about your parentage would cause you more pain than clarity. So he asked Lysander to sacrifice his relationship with his own daughter? He asked Lysander to sacrifice his claim to fatherhood so that you could have the stability of an unquestioned family identity. Whether that was right or wrong, Father Gabriel spread his hands. That's between Aurelius and God now. Seraphina leaned back against the pew, feeling the weight of generations of family worship in the sacred space. Lysander said Aurelius made him promise on his deathbed that he'd never tell me the truth, that he'd let sleeping dogs lie. Yes, Father Gabriel confirmed quietly. I was there for that conversation. Aurelius was terrified that learning about your biological parentage would make you feel illegitimate, unwanted. He'd seen too many families torn apart by secrets and felt that some truths were more destructive than protective lies. But the lie was destructive too. I spent 28 years feeling rejected by Lysander, wondering what was wrong with me that my own uncle couldn't seem to love me. Father Gabriel's expression grew pained. That was the tragedy none of them anticipated. They were so focused on protecting you from one kind of pain that they inadvertently caused another. Seraphina felt a fresh wave of grief, not just for the relationship she'd never had with Lysander, but for Aurelius, who had died believing his choice had protected her. Do you think he was wrong? Aurelius, I mean. Should he have told me the truth? I think, Father Gabriel said slowly, that Aurelius made the best decision he knew how to make with the information and experience he had. He loved you enough to claim you as his own, and he loved his brother enough to ask him to step aside so that love could flourish without complication. And what about Lysander? What about what he sacrificed? Lysander made his own choice to honor his brother's dying wish, even at tremendous personal cost. That speaks to a kind of love, too. Love for his brother, love for you, love for the family structure that Aurelius had built. Father Gabriel turned to face her more directly. The question now isn't whether their choices were right or wrong. The question is what you choose to do with the truth now that you have it. Seraphina sat in the quiet of the sanctuary, surrounded by the weight of decades of prayer and confession, births and deaths, joys and sorrows. The stained glass windows cast jeweled light across her hands, and she thought about the different kinds of love that had shaped her life. Aurelius's protective claiming, Thalia's careful secret-keeping, and Lysander's distant sacrifice. I don't know how to forgive them. Not because what they did was unforgivable, but because I don't know how to separate the hurt from the love anymore.
Perhaps, Father Gabriel suggested gently, that's because they were never really separate to begin with. Love and hurt often intertwine in families, especially when people are trying to protect each other from pain they can't imagine. As she sat there in the church where her family's drama had played out through christenings and weddings and funerals, Seraphina began to understand something she hadn't before. That love could be expressed through distance as surely as through closeness, through sacrifice as surely as through presence. The question wasn't whether her family had loved her. They had, each in their own flawed and complicated way. The question was whether she could learn to live with the knowledge of how much that love had cost them all. Leaving the sanctuary of St. Mary's, Seraphina felt something had shifted in her understanding, though she couldn't yet articulate what. Father Gabriel's words about love and sacrifice had planted seeds of comprehension, but she needed to understand the full scope of what her family had endured. The person who could provide those answers was the same one whose confused revelation had started this entire unraveling. Evangeline's assisted living facility sat on the edge of town, a modern building designed to look homey despite its institutional purpose. Seraphina had visited regularly since her aunt's diagnosis, but never with the weight of family secrets pressing down on her like this. The receptionist recognized her with a smile and directed her to the small garden courtyard where Evangeline often spent her afternoons when the weather was mild. She found her aunt sitting on a wrought iron bench beneath an oak tree, its autumn leaves creating a carpet of gold and crimson around her feet. Evangeline was feeding breadcrumbs to a small group of sparrows, her movements careful and deliberate. There was something peaceful about the scene that made Seraphina hesitate. Her aunt looked more centered than she had in months, and she didn't want to shatter whatever clarity Evangeline had found. "Sarah, dear," Evangeline called without turning around, as if she'd sensed her presence. "I wondered when you'd come to see me. I imagine you have questions." Seraphina approached cautiously and settled beside her aunt on the bench. "How did you know it was me?" "Your footsteps," Evangeline replied with a small smile. "Light but determined, just like when you were little and trying to sneak cookies from my kitchen jar." Her eyes, when she turned them toward Seraphina, were remarkably clear. "I'm having one of my good days today. Dr. Martinez says they'll become less frequent, so we should make the most of it." The clinical matter-of-factness with which Evangeline discussed her own cognitive decline made Seraphina's chest tight. "And Evangeline, about what you said yesterday at your birthday party, about Lysander being your real father?" Evangeline finished gently. "Yes, I remember. I wasn't confused about that, dear. Sometimes the truth just slips out when my usual filters fail." She scattered more breadcrumbs, watching the sparrows dart closer. Perhaps it was past time for slipping out. Seraphina studied her aunt's profile, noting the familiar frost cheekbones and the silver hair that had once been the same shade as Lysander's. "How long have you known?" "Since the night you were conceived. Lysander came to my house afterward, completely undone. I'd never seen my brother cry before that night, but he sat at my kitchen table and wept like his world was ending." The image of Lysander, stoic, controlled Lysander crying at his sister's kitchen table, was almost impossible for Seraphina to conjure. Why was he crying? Because he'd fallen in love with his brother's girlfriend and betrayed everything he believed about loyalty and honor. Evangeline's voice carried the weight of old grief. Because he knew that single moment of weakness and need would complicate everything for everyone he loved. Seraphina felt a chill that had nothing to do with the October air. He was in love with my mother? Desperately. Had been for years, long before she started dating Aurelius. But Lysander was older, more serious, focused on building his business.
Sacrifice and loss that had shaped every interaction she'd ever had with her family. "I don't know how to live with this knowledge, Aunt Evangeline. I don't know how to face Lysander knowing what he gave up for me." Evangeline squeezed her hand again, her eyes still remarkably clear despite the gathering dusk. "You live with it the same way we all have, dear. One day at a time, making the best choices you can with the love you have available." She paused, studying Seraphina's face with the intensity of someone trying to memorize it. "The question is, what choice will you make now that you know the truth?" As they sat together in the growing darkness, surrounded by the quiet rustling of autumn leaves, Seraphina realized that understanding the full scope of her family's sacrifice hadn't made forgiveness easier. It had made everything infinitely more complicated. But perhaps, she thought, that was what real love looked like. Not simple or easy, but complex and costly, and somehow still worth everything. The drive from Evangeline's facility to Restwood Cemetery took 20 minutes through darkening streets, but Seraphina felt as if she were traveling through 28 years of accumulated grief and misunderstanding. Her aunt's revelations had crystallized something inside her, a fierce determination to break the cycle of sacrifice and silence that had defined her family for nearly 30 decades. She called Lysander from the parking lot of the cemetery. "We need to finish our conversation," she said when he answered, not bothering with pleasantries. "Meet me at Restwood Cemetery, at Aurelius's grave." "Seraphina, I don't think—" "This isn't a request, Lysander. You've spent 28 years honoring a promise to a dead man. I think it's time he heard what that promise has cost all of us." The silence on the other end stretched long enough that she wondered if he'd hung up. Finally, his voice came through, rough, with something that might have been resignation. "I'll be there in 15 minutes. Restwood Cemetery sat on a hill overlooking the town, its older sections marked by weathered headstones and mature oak trees that had witnessed decades of grief and remembrance. Aurelius's grave was in the newer section, where the headstones were uniform in size and the landscaping carefully maintained. Seraphina had visited regularly in the 8 years since his death, but tonight felt different. Tonight, she was bringing someone who had loved Aurelius deeply, but had never been able to properly grieve him. She found the familiar granite marker, Aurelius James Blackwood, beloved husband and father, 1965-2017. The words that had once brought her comfort now felt incomplete, missing acknowledgement of the complex web of relationships that had defined his life. Fresh flowers, roses that Thalia must have placed recently, lay wilted against the stone. Lysander's truck pulled into the cemetery just as full darkness settled over the hillside. She watched him approach through the pools of light cast by decorative lampposts, his movements careful and deliberate, as if he were walking toward his own execution. He'd changed out of his work clothes into the pressed khakis and button-down shirt he wore to family gatherings. Armor, she realized, for conversations that felt too big for everyday clothing. "I haven't been here since the funeral," he said quietly, stopping a few feet away from the grave. "Didn't feel like I had the right." "Why not? He was your brother." "Because I was in love with his wife. Because I was the father of his daughter. Because every time I looked at this headstone, I'd be reminded that I was grateful for his sacrifice while simultaneously resenting it." Lysander's voice was barely above a whisper. "That's not the kind of grief a good brother should carry." Seraphina studied his profile in the lamplight, noting the deep lines around his eyes that spoke of years of sleepless nights and careful self-control. "You've been carrying guilt about things that weren't your fault. Mom was lonely, you were both scared about Aurelius, and you found comfort in each other. That's human, not evil."
One night of human weakness created a lifetime of complications for everyone I loved.
"One night of human connection created me."
Seraphina corrected sharply. "Are you saying you regret that?" Lysander turned to face her fully, and in the artificial twilight his eyes looked haunted.
"I could never regret you. Even when staying away from you was killing me slowly, I never regretted that you existed."
Then why are you still punishing yourself? Aurelius has been dead for 8 years, Lysander. 8 years during which you could have been my father openly, could have had some kind of relationship with me, could have built a life that included more than work and solitude.
Because I promised him.
You promised a dying man who was trying to make sense of an impossible situation. Seraphina's voice rose, echoing off the headstones. You think he wanted you to spend the rest of your life alone? You think he wanted me to grow up feeling rejected by my own father?
He wanted you to feel secure.
I felt abandoned. The words came out raw, carrying 28 years of accumulated hurt. Do you understand that? I felt abandoned by someone I desperately wanted to love me.
Every birthday when you left early, every Christmas when you stood apart from the family photos, every graduation where you watched from the back of the room, I thought it meant I didn't matter to you.
Lysander's carefully maintained composure finally cracked. "You mattered more than anything," he said, his voice breaking. "You mattered so much that watching you succeed felt like watching a miracle I wasn't allowed to claim. Do you think it was easy? Do you think I didn't want to be the one helping with homework and teaching you to drive and walking you down the aisle someday?"
Then why didn't you? Seraphina stepped closer, forcing him to maintain eye contact. Aurelius is gone. The promise you made was to protect a family that no longer exists in the same form. I'm 28 years old, Lysander. I can handle knowing that my parentage is complicated. What I can't handle is losing more years to a secret that's already cost us everything.
I don't know how to be anything other than what I've always been to you.
You could start by calling me your daughter. The words hung in the air between them like a challenge. Lysander looked down at Aurelius's headstone, then back at Seraphina, and she saw decades of suppressed emotion warring in his expression.
I loved him. Aurelius was the best man I ever knew, and I betrayed him in the worst possible way.
You loved his girlfriend before she was his girlfriend, and you comforted her when you both thought he was dead. That's not betrayal. That's being human in an impossible situation.
And then I spent 28 years watching him raise my daughter while I pretended to be satisfied with being her distant uncle.
And now you get to choose. You can keep honoring a promise made in grief to a man who couldn't have imagined what it would cost, or you can choose to be my father while we still have time.
Lysander was quiet for a long moment, his gaze moving between the headstone and Seraphina's face. When he spoke, his voice was so quiet she had to strain to hear it. "I used to watch you sleep when you were a baby. When I'd come to check on your mother, you'd be in your crib and I'd stand in the doorway just looking at you. You had this way of curling your tiny fist around your ear, and I'd think about how much I wanted to pick you up and hold you and tell you that you were the most beautiful thing I'd ever seen."
Why didn't you?
Because she wasn't mine to hold. Where you can direct a voice, create realistic dialogue, and so much more. Edit these placeholders to get started.
Because Aurelius was your father, and I was just the man who helped create you and then had to step aside so better people could raise you. Seraphina felt tears streaming down her face. I'm not asking you to replace Aurelius or diminish what he meant to me. I'm asking you to stop diminishing what you could mean to me. Lysander looked down at his brother's grave one more time, then back at the woman who had been his daughter all along. I don't know how to stop being afraid of wanting something I've convinced myself I don't deserve. You start by admitting that you want it, Seraphina said. You start by saying the words we've both been afraid to say. I want to be your father, Lysander said, his voice raw with years of suppressed longing. I want to stop pretending that loving you from a distance has been enough. I want whatever relationship we can build together, even if it's imperfect and complicated and 28 years too late. Then let's build it, Seraphina whispered, and stepped forward to embrace the man who had been her father all along, even when neither of them was allowed to admit it. The embrace lasted longer than either of them had expected. 28 years of careful distance dissolved in a moment of mutual recognition. When they finally separated, Lysander's eyes were bright with unshed tears, and Seraphina felt something she'd never experienced before. The simple, uncomplicated knowledge that she was loved by her father without qualification or restraint. This is going to be awkward, Lysander said, his voice rough with emotion but carrying a note of something that might have been relief. I don't know how to be anyone's father, let alone yours. We'll figure it out, Seraphina replied, surprised by how certain she felt. We have time now. We have the truth. That's more than we've ever had before.
They stood together in the cemetery's quiet, both looking down at Aurelius's headstone with a new understanding of the man who had shaped their lives through his choices. The guilt and gratitude, love and loss that had defined their relationship with his memory felt different now, more complex, but somehow cleaner. I should call your mother. Let her know that we're going to try being father and daughter? Seraphina finished gently. She'll be relieved. I think carrying this secret has been harder on her than any of us realized. Acknowledgement. When will you be ready? When I'm 35? 40? When you're too old to enjoy being my father? Seraphina's voice carried gentle challenge rather than accusation. We've lost enough time, Lysander. I don't want to lose more because we're both afraid of changing the patterns we've established. I'm terrified of disappointing you, he admitted. You've built up this idea of what a father should be based on Aurelius, and he was extraordinary. I'm just a contractor who builds houses and stays too quiet at family gatherings. Aurelius was wonderful, Seraphina agreed, but he wasn't you. And I need to know who you are, not as a replacement for him, but as yourself. As my biological father who happens to also be a contractor who builds beautiful houses and keeps his feelings carefully guarded. Over the next 2 hours, they talked in ways they never had before. Lysander shared stories about his childhood with Aurelius and Evangeline, about building his business from nothing, about the women he dated briefly before remembering his promise and pulling away. Seraphina told him about college, about her work in marketing, about her growing interest in therapy that had been sparked partly by her own family's complex dynamics. I've been thinking about going back to school, she said as the evening wound down, getting a degree in counseling. This whole experience has made me realize how much people struggle with family secrets and complicated relationships. That sounds like something you'd be good at, Lysander said, and the simple approval in his voice meant more to her than any elaborate praise could have. When he finally prepared to leave, they stood at her door in an awkward dance of affection neither quite knew how to navigate. Finally, Lysander stepped forward and hugged her again, less desperate than their embrace at the cemetery, but somehow more intentional. "Thank you," he said against her hair, "for forcing this conversation, for not giving up on the possibility that we could be something to each other." "Thank you for being brave enough to break your promise," Seraphina replied. "I know that wasn't easy." After he left, Seraphina called Thalia, who answered on the first ring as if she'd been waiting by the phone. "How did it go?" her mother asked, anxiety evident in her voice. "We're going to try," Seraphina said simply. "We're going to figure out how to be father and daughter, even if we're starting 28 years late." Thalia's sob of relief was audible through the phone. "I'm so glad. I've been carrying this guilt for so long, wondering if we made the right choices, if we protected you or just created different kinds of pain." "You did the best you could with an impossible situation," Seraphina said, finally able to offer her mother the forgiveness she'd been seeking. "We all did. Now we get to do better." As she prepared for bed that night, Seraphina felt something she hadn't experienced since childhood, the simple security of being loved openly by both her parents. It would take time to build new patterns, to learn how to be Lysander's daughter and help him learn how to be her father. But for the first time in her life, time felt like a gift rather than a burden, and the future stretched ahead full of conversations they were finally free to have. 6 months later, spring had transformed the Frost family home's backyard into a canvas of blooming dogwoods and fresh green grass. The setting was the same as countless family gatherings over the years, but everything else had fundamentally changed. Today marked Seraphina's graduation from the accelerated counseling certification program she'd enrolled in immediately after the truth came out. And for the first time in decades, the celebration felt genuinely joyful rather than carefully orchestrated. Seraphina stood at the kitchen window, watching Lysander assemble a picnic table he'd built specifically for the occasion. His movements were methodical and precise, as always, but there was something different in his posture, A relaxation in his shoulders that spoke to burdens finally set down. When Thalia approached him with the plate of sandwiches, he didn't step away or find an excuse to busy himself elsewhere. Instead, he accepted the food with a smile that reached his eyes and said something that made her laugh. "Hard to believe how much can change in half a year," Jasper observed, joining Seraphina at the window. He'd driven down from Portland for the celebration, and his presence felt like a bridge between her old life and new one. "Sometimes I wake up and forget," Seraphina admitted. "I'll think about calling Uncle Lysander about something, and then I remember he's not my uncle anymore. He's my father. It still feels surreal." Good surreal or overwhelming surreal? Seraphina considered the question as she watched Lysander demonstrate some feature of the table's construction to Thalia, his hands gesturing with an enthusiasm she'd never seen before. Mostly good. There are moments when I look at him and think about all the conversations we never had, all the milestones he missed because he felt like he couldn't be there in the way he wanted to be. That makes me sad. But then he'll do something like build me a picnic table for my graduation party, and I realize we're making new memories now. The past 6 months had been a careful dance of relationship building, full of awkward moments and unexpected discoveries. Lysander had approached fatherhood with the same methodical attention he brought to construction projects, researching books about adult relationships with parents, asking Thalia careful questions about Seraphina's childhood milestones he'd missed, even attending a few of her counseling classes as moral support when she'd nervously mentioned having trouble with a particularly challenging assignment. "Speaking of your father," Jasper said with a grin, "he's been asking me about your dating life. Apparently, he feels like he has 28 years of protective parenting to catch up on." "Oh," Seraphina groaned. "He asked me last week if I was seeing anyone seriously, and when I said no, he looked relieved. I think he's having fantasies about intimidating potential boyfriends with power tools." "Could be worse. At least he's not trying to set you up with the sons of his construction clients. Don't give him ideas." Through the window, they watched Evangeline make her way slowly across the yard, supported by her walker, but moving with determination. Her good days were becoming frequent, but today's clarity had been a gift they were all grateful for. She settled into one of the lawn chairs Lysander had positioned in the shade, and immediately both Thalia and Lysander moved toward her with the unconscious protectiveness that had characterized the family's treatment of her since her diagnosis. "I should go help set up," Seraphina said, but she lingered at the window for another moment, struck by the sight of her family working together without the undercurrent of tension that had shadowed every gathering for as long as she could remember. The graduation celebration was deliberately small. Just the core family plus Jasper and Father Gabriel, who had become something of an unofficial family counselor during the months of adjustment. As they gathered around Lysander's handcrafted table, Seraphina felt a completeness she'd never experienced before, as if puzzle pieces that had been scattered for decades were finally clicking into place. "Before we eat," Evangeline said, her voice carrying the authority that came with being the family's eldest member, "I want to say something while my mind is clear." The table fell quiet, everyone understanding the precious nature of Evangeline's lucid moments. "I've watched this family carry secrets and guilt for nearly 30 years, she began, her gaze moving from face to face. "I watched my brother sacrifice his chance at open parenthood for a promise made in grief. I watched Thalia carry the weight of choices made in fear and love. I watched Aurelius build a family on a foundation of conscious forgiveness. And I watched Seraphina grow up wondering why she couldn't earn the love that was already hers by right." Seraphina felt tears prick her eyes as Evangeline continued. "Today, watching Lysander build furniture for his daughter's celebration, watching Thalia breathe freely without the weight of secrets, watching all of you learn how to love each other openly, I see what we should have been all along. Not perfect, but honest. Not without pain, but without pretense." Evangeline reached across the table and took Seraphina's hand with surprising strength. You were always loved, dear girl. But now you're loved without fear, without reservation, without the careful distances that we thought would protect you, but only protected us from having to face the complexity of real relationships. I love you too, Aunt Evangeline, Seraphina said, her voice thick with emotion. I know you do, and I'm proud of the woman you've become, the work you're choosing to do. Helping other families navigate their secrets and complications, there's no better use for the wisdom you've gained from our mistakes. As they shared the meal Lysander had grilled with the same precision he brought to everything else, Seraphina found herself studying the dynamics that had emerged over the past months. Lysander still wasn't demonstrative, that wasn't his nature, but he listened with an intensity that made her feel heard in ways she'd never experienced. When she talked about her classes or her struggles with particularly difficult concepts, he offered the kind of thoughtful questions that showed he'd been paying attention not just to her words, but to the emotions behind them. Thalia seemed younger somehow, as if the burden of secret-keeping had been aging her in ways none of them had recognized. She moved between her daughter and Lysander with an ease that spoke to relationships finally free of guilt and careful boundaries. "I have something for you," Lysander said, as the afternoon began to wind down. He disappeared into the house and returned with a small wrapped box that immediately reminded Seraphina of the compass necklace he'd given her for her 16th birthday. Inside was a key ring with a single key attached, brass, old-fashioned, and clearly meaningful in some way she didn't understand. "It's to my house," Lysander explained, his voice careful but warm. "I know you have your own place, and I'm not trying to overstep, but I wanted you to know that you always have a place with me, that my home is your home whenever you need it to be." The gesture was so perfectly Lysander, practical, meaningful, and deeply emotional despite its simplicity that Seraphina felt tears threatening again. "Thank you," she said, closing her fingers around the key. "I love it, and I love you. I love you too."
Lysander replied, and this time the words came easily, without the weight of years of suppression behind them. As the celebration wound down and guests began to leave, Seraphina found herself alone with her parents, both of them, for the first time since learning the truth. They stood together in the backyard, surrounded by the remnants of a successful party and the promise of many more to come. "We did good work today," Thalia observed, surveying the cleaned-up yard with satisfaction. "We did good work these past 6 months," Lysander corrected gently. "Learning how to be a family without secrets, without careful distances, without the fear that honesty would destroy us." Seraphina looked at both of them, the woman who had raised her with fierce love and protective instincts, and the man who had loved her from a distance until they'd finally found the courage to close the gap, and felt a peace she'd never known was possible. "I used to think love meant protecting people from painful truths, but I've learned something in my counseling classes, something I think our family proves. Love isn't about protecting people from pain, it's about being willing to walk through pain together towards something more honest and whole." As the sun set over the Frost family home, casting long shadows across the yard where 3 generations had gathered to celebrate new beginnings, Seraphina understood that some stories don't end so much as transform. Her family would continue to evolve, continue to learn how to love each other without the barriers they'd once thought necessary. And she would carry the lessons of their journey about sacrifice and truth, distance and connection, the different ways people protect what they love, into her work helping other families navigate their own complicated paths toward understanding. The key to Lysander's house weighed heavy in her pocket, a tangible reminder that sometimes the most profound transformations begin with the simple courage to say what has long been true. "I am your daughter. You are my father. We are family. Complicated and imperfect, and finally, blessedly honest."
Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.